Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
Alright, so here's the base we're going to be working the lava on. Since you saw it last, I put just some gray paint down over the gray primer. You could just do one coat of gray if you like. And then I threw a black wash over the rocks just to give some darkness to the recesses, because this is going to be a obsidian, obviously lava rock, it's like a darker color. So if you want to do a couple layers, if you want to go with a darker gray, that's fine. I just went with this for now. The cork isn't really what the focus of this is. So what we're going to start with is the base coat for the lava. And in order to help the yellows and the reds show up better, we're going to use kind of a yellowish brown. I'm going to use plague brown and put that with a brush in between all the recessed areas where I want the lava to be. Alright, so I've got my brown going. We're just going to get it into the base areas here. Doesn't have to be this exact color, but you're looking for a yellowish brown to give you a nice base for the lava to kind of get those colors to look their best. If you thin it down, you might want to have to do two coats, but since we're going over kind of a gray, it's not as dark. But if you used black, or you're just not as happy with how the first coat looks, then go ahead and throw a second coat down on there. So while this lava is drying, you can do a couple other things to the base if you want to enhance it. You can see here, I've gone with just some black. I kind of thinned it a little bit and painted it onto the middle sections of the rock. Now I've let that dry, and now I've grabbed some stonewall gray. And I'm going to use, or any light gray will work for this, and I've got my dry brush handy. I've got some paint on there, and now I'm just going to start highlighting the outer edges of the rock to start working on those kind of visual variations while the rest of the paint is drying. Obviously try not to get anything inside the brown areas while it's drying. It's no big deal if you get some while you're dry brushing, just make sure it's mostly dry. I'm still just waiting for some of the recesses. Another thing when you're thinking about dry brushing is try to keep most of the strokes in the same direction. You can see now it's starting to get a nice edge highlight, and that'll help bring out some of the OSL effects we're going to get from the airbrush when we start using that. If you got cracks and crevices, it's a good time to get those highlighted. Just reach what you can. It's not all going to show, but this will make a nice visual scene for the base and show a more complete and realistic looking setting. Once that's dry, we'll be ready to start airbrushing. I've got some model color light orange, but any bright orange will work for the intent of what we're going to do here. So in order for me to airbrush this, I'm going to add some flow improver into the pot, as well as a little bit of water, and that's to make a non-airbrush ready paint ready for airbrushing. You got to thin it out some, otherwise it's going to clog up in the pot. So I'm just adding a little bit of flow improver, a little bit of water, some paint. Mix that all up. I'm going to show you how to backflow an airbrush, which is where you put your finger over the nozzle and then you run the air and then slightly move the needle to allow the air to come back into the pot and mix up that remaining bit of paint. This is an Iwata CS Eclipse, and this should work on just about any dual action airbrush if you have a different one. Check the consistency. Obviously you don't want it to be super runny or get stuck or spatter. So, all right. So now we're looking to go over all of this with the orange. I have to let my airbrush run just a little bit to let the regulator catch up. I'm running a single regulator right now, as I'm not normally airbrushing in this area. So it's pretty thin, so try not to let it build up too much. I got a little spot there that it's got a little bit of a run, but I'll smooth it out once it dries. Don't try to fix it all at once. You're not worried about if it gets on the rocks and the cracks. In fact, that's kind of what you want. Aim at the areas that you want to get orange, but also don't get hung up on trying to get the nozzle right into the area where you need it to be. And don't worry if a little bit of the paint gets on the edges. It's going to help, again, with that OSL effect that we're going to eventually have. Also, if you find that it's getting too wet initially, back your airbrush up a little bit and start with more air, and then just gradually, if you have a dual action airbrush, what I'm doing is I'm gradually coming back on the trigger just to let a little bit of paint out and get a feel for how that paint mix works. That's the thing you have to do with non-airbrush ready paints, is you just have to get a feel for it. And I wish there was a end-all be-all answer for everybody on how exactly to do that, but really the deciding factor on that is just practice, and you start to get a feel for what the paint should have consistency-wise. All right, so you can see it's starting to put more orange than that brownish yellow, which is good. Just working kind of thin. If you try to do too much, if your paint's too thick, you end up losing that blend effect. You know, yeah, it coats faster, but you know, if you get too much paint on a certain area, then it loses that effect. So I'm also running air while I do this, just to help dry things, speed that process along. So right now I'm not painting, I'm just running air. If you put it on too much while it's wet, you're gonna end up just having runs on the paint. If you're learning how to airbrush, this is a good way to start, because you're going to learn trigger control. These bases, as you could see from the first part of the video, don't take much to assemble. They're cheap, so you can practice. You can make, you know, 4, 5, 10 of these or whatever, and get a lot of practice in, as well as work on trigger control. Kind of touching up a few things here and there. I wear the glove mainly just so I don't get paint on my hands when I'm airbrushing, but it also is nice to have to avoid getting oils and things like that on paints if you're painting the miniatures. Alright, so now we've got a good base coat of this orange. So we're going to let that continue to dry. If you were hooked up to a compressor regularly, you didn't have to refill it like mine, since I've got it outside of where I normally work, then you could just keep blowing air on it to get it to dry more. But you want to let that dry, because flow improver is a retarder, so it will slow down the drying process. So you can't work as fast maybe as if you were using just a brush paint. The other thing I'm going to do is a little trick I learned. Grab a water bottle cap and take any excess paint you have, dump it out of the pot, and now you've got extra touch-up to use either with the brush, or you can put it back in the airbrush, or you can even blend with it maybe later on, so that the same paint that you're using right now, you don't have to go back and try to either re-add it, or especially if you're doing blends and mixes and things like that, it's a good way to go back and get to the same color that you were using on a certain phase and not have to try to mix it exactly and get it to match. So, all right, so I'm going to clean out my airbrush and we'll hit the next color. All right, so it's dry. Now I've got a model color red in my airbrush. You can use any, just, you know, bright red. That's the requirement here. I've done the exact same thing I did before with the orange. I've added flow improver and a little bit of water to thin it out, because that's model color. It's not a Viejo game error, but if you have that, that'll work too. So now what I'm going to be aiming to do is put the red, and I'm trying to get it mostly around the perimeter. I'm not trying to put it into the middle area, because that's where we're going to want to have the brighter colors. So since we're going to do, since I've got a little bit of an edge on this side over here, I'm going to start there. Another thing too, if you're starting out and learning how to aim, start from the bottom up as the paint comes out. You can also use your glove and start to see and kind of start to work that triggers to where the paint starts to flow, so you can learn how to get just a little bit of paint and mostly air, and then how you can get, you know, larger coverage, things like that. So those are things that, you know, you learn over time, trigger control and things like that. But what I was getting at here is you can start at the bottom, the paint's hitting my finger, and then bring it up, and now I'm on the base and just barely adding a little bit of red, because I'm just using so little trigger pressure to just add a slight amount of red. You can increase that slightly, but if you're learning how and want to kind of get an idea, you don't want to be aiming right at it and then pull the trigger, because you could end up with a burst of red. So work off to the bottom and then start to bring it up. Or if you've got an edge, then that's a good way to help you get a little more confidence as you learn to airbrush. And again, this is thin so that it doesn't cover in just a heavy coat. The other difficult part about this is going to be getting in a little bit tighter, because I don't want to get too much red in an area where I've got some of that orange and I want to add a little more. So I'm just going to turn and try to adjust the airbrush as we go. And we're going to add some lighter color there too. So don't worry if you go a little too far and you're not, oh, it's not perfect. It's not a big deal. It's real forgiving. That's why. First off, is why I'm demonstrating it, because I'm not the greatest airbrush guy, but I wouldn't be showing you something that was so difficult that you wouldn't be able to try it out your first or second time using an airbrush. For those of you that want to know, I'm using about 20 to 22 pounds of pressure. I normally run a dual regulator setup and a water separator so that I get a more consistent pressure, but because this is off of my little portable compressor, which is a tank, it spikes and then sets up after I've got the trigger on for a couple seconds. So you want some on that rock, because you want that OSL to work for you. That's what the airbrush is going to do. But the byproduct of this painting this is that you're going to get a nice glow effect on those rocks by virtually just doing what you were going to do to paint the lava. It's just a bonus. When you're using a lot of air and not a lot of paint, periodically you're going to want to clean the tip off with a toothbrush. I'm going to link Next Level Painting's YouTube channel. He basically is the reason I know how to airbrush, and he's got a great channel. He does Twitch streams as well. Super talented guy. If you want to learn more about airbrushing and how to clean your airbrush, take it apart, how to maintain it, all different ways, things you can do. I mean, stuff you wouldn't even imagine you can do with an airbrush. The guy is really talented. So look down in the description there, and you'll have a link to his YouTube channel. So it's coming along pretty good. Again, I'm going to dump the paint into a bottle cap. I'm going to let that dry, and we're going to switch colors. Now that the red's dry, or the rest of it's all dry enough, I'm going to use some Army Painter Rain Matter Beige. You can use any off-white or creamy type of white. You don't want pure white, it's just a little too much. I've done the exact same thing again, added some flow improver and water into my airbrush. Now I'm looking to basically aim for the areas where I want it to be the brightest. You're probably wondering, well, where is that going to be? Well, that's out on the edges or anywhere where you want to have a hot, like yellow spot. The hottest part of lava is going to have, you know, more yellowish to light yellow and white. So I'm just going to work some of this white in. I've got a bit of a ridge here, so I have to kind of change the angle of the brush around. And just kind of walk some of it into the area where I want that extra highlight. I'm aiming away from, just to try to not to get any on the rocks, but that doesn't mean you can't point it at it. Just be aware that a little bit of overspray might get where you don't want it to go if you get a little bit carried away. A nice way to do this too is to kind of do a thin layer and then blow some air on it, let it dry, and see, because it's going to mute out with the color as it dries and flashes off. And if you think it did too much, don't worry, you can go back and use one of those reds or the oranges to kind of touch up around the edges or wherever you got a little carried away with it, and go back to doing what you're doing, carry on there. So again, not a huge deal. So now we've got our pre-highlight, and we're going to work in some yellow. So now I'm ready to hit the yellow over the pre-highlight. I'm using Flash Kits yellow. This is a really good yellow, so I'm not a huge like GW Citadel paint guy, but their yellow is awesome. So one thing I've done slightly different from the previous mixes though is I've got this really thin. It is almost to the point of like a wash. It is very thin. When you put it on the paper here, it almost is just a yellow wet. That's how thin it is. So now we can be a little less accurate with the yellow. I'm still going to aim for mostly the white, but I'm going to just do real thin, quick passes because it's such a thin and wet consistency. I don't have a whole lot of time where I can just, you know, keep it on there and try to spread the paint. It's okay if it gets, you know, here or there or onto some of the red and the orange. It's going to help kind of tie some of that together. So I'm using mostly just passes with air here, you know, 2 or 3 passes with air, and then I'm giving a nice light yellow pass. Just drying it again with air. I'm pretty happy with that. So now it's you can call it done if you want. You can also, if you wish, you can go in and put some black into some of the recessed areas to make it look more like, you know, burnt carbon, similar to this top area here, because, you know, you've got, it's mostly a globe, you know, it's recessed and there's little, you know, dips and dents and things like that would be darker. And there's a couple ways you can go about doing that. You could use the airbrush if you want to get more of a black and kind of a smooth transition, which is fine. You can also go and use a wash, or you could just use thinned paint and hit it with the brush into certain areas. So I think I'm going to use a brush. I've got some thinned out black paint. Got a brush here. Give you an idea. You can see it's definitely not, you know, 100% opacity, which is, you know, not what you want in this case. So now I'm just going to go and find some of these cracks and crevices and things that I want a little darker. Kind of enhance the overall appearance of the light and shadow effect. Definitely in this crack in here. You know, you may not have gotten to it with the primer, or you know, maybe it got a little more red than you wanted on there. This is where you get to kind of make it your own. Because it's thin and we're kind of doing a bit, almost a black glaze, you know, it's not going to cover completely, and it's not going to obscure all of your little highlights and neat shadow effects and things like that. So okay. If you were going to use a wash for this, obviously you'd want to keep it, you know, pretty thinned out, but you don't want it to get too carried away and end up running off into the reds and the yellows. So I just added a little bit of water to kind of work some of this a little more over to the red to give a little bit of a transition. Add some variety. If it gets away from you, a little bit of water. Because it's so thin, you can sweep it right back up. You can do as many layers of this if you know as you want. You don't have to do it all in one pass. You can keep it thin, come back, do a little more, see how it looks, change your mind, go get a snack. But I am going to call this done. So thanks for watching. Follow us at ChemoSpecs online on Facebook. You can also leave messages here in the YouTube channel. Subscribe, tell your friends, all that good stuff. I've got that link to Kenny Boucher's Next Level Painting page as well to learn how to use the airbrush like a boss. Thanks to him and props to his tutorials and guidance on that. And we'll see you all next time.
Shutdown sequence initiated.